So good morning, everyone. I'm Professor Gilly Salmon. I'm actually calling you from the Netherlands this morning, although I normally work in London. So what I've been asked to do this morning is to talk about the 5-stage model and to explore with you some of its many uses, which I hope will help you in your work as teachers. So I've called my talk Design and Delivery for Online Learning because the 5-stage model will help you both in preparing to teach online and also delivery of the teaching. So I'm going to talk about it in both of those ways. And in doing so, I think I should say that I think it's really, really important to start to think about the pedagogy of everything you do from the design point of view, because that is truly the only way you can bring in all the multiple components, the technology the student needs, where you want to make interventions as a teacher and put it into one whole area. And of course, importantly, also to build the scaffold so you can visibly see your students making progress. But the delivery then implies what you do, what only you can do as the teacher. And I think if you separate the two aspects out, you'll find you'll get much better quality teaching and you'll be happier about what you're offering to your students. So we're going to talk about design first. So by this I mean is, I touched the keyboard there, sorry. By this I mean looking at the whole aspect of producing a really high quality, effective pathway for your students to follow. And in doing that, you've got two key things that you need to place along that journey. And this is the idea of a scaffold. In other words, a structure where they can gradually achieve. And in educational purposes, there are two key things to consider. One is how you're going to scaffold the knowledge that you want them to acquire towards the learning outcomes, and then how you're going to scaffold them gradually becoming more competent, more effective, more collaborative learners all the way through. So I'm going to talk about both of those things. So one of the first things I'd like you to consider is something called threshold concepts. I've put some references at the end, so this is just a very brief introduction. But the most sophisticated, effective teachers at all levels, but particularly at university level and professional learning, are moving away from the idea that they need to teach content or a grand theory and moving towards understanding that what's their student experience is about is moving through a portal or a gateway that opens up things that they didn't have access to before. So if I was with you now, I would be walking about on the stage and going through doorways. So when you think about this, it's quite good to stand up and imagine you're walking about and going around into something. And they are core concepts that you need to identify for whatever discipline you're teaching, for your module, that once your students have understood, they will be transformation or in the perception of a particular subject that you're teaching. And so it's quite different from thinking about a learning outcome or a graduate attribute. So I'm going to try and describe to you a little more what these might actually be. And the other aspect of it is that if you're going to teach people about threshold concepts, you also want them to be able to be assessed in an authentic way. So there's no point in training people to be doctors or lawyers or engineers or all that, artists, all the other 101 things, if you then give them an ordinary closed book exam at the end. You really do need to think about the end in mind and think about not only the standards, but a real world assessment that will be meaningful to the students and also meaningful to the a future employer. So we're thinking not only their contribution to the future of the world through their employment, but also their personal career. And we really need them to leave our educational institutions with confidence that they have learned things that will help them with that. So not much really, and also to achieve all of those things, you really do need to use a scaffolded model. So this is what makes things authentic. And this is what borrows from design thinking rather than transmission of teaching thinking. So I suggest, in order to try and get into your mind what the threshold concepts actually are, you'd think what a future employer would consider valid and significant, and emphasize the realistic complexity, ill-structured problems or tasks. And I'm going to show you some ways of doing that. And also look for collaboration that will happen in the workplace. None of us work in isolation. So really, when you're teaching and preparing people for the future, that's what you need to be doing. So in the teaching context, you want to bring as much as you can into the professional teaching environment. So back to the 5-stage model now. The 5-stage model was something that I've been working on for more than 25 years now. And I'd like you to know just a little bit about the origins of it. It was developed originally with and for business school students when I was working in the UK Open University. At the time, I had around 1,000 MBA students who were all around Europe. And it was even before the days of Windows or VLEs and LMSs, anything like that. We didn't have any of those things. All we had was an asynchronous bulletin board that you could log in and you could navigate through by number. But because I was working for the Open University, I had a volume of students and they were all remote, all in different places. And that was unusual in those days. Of course, you're used to it now, but we weren't at the time. So the reason I'm telling you this was these students and the way we were teaching, we were thinking about it right from the start. We were thinking about it as something quite different. And we were able to set up bulletin boards and then observe how students use them. We probably would not be allowed ethically to do that now. And the model that I built, based entirely on the students' behaviour, was then a grounded model. So it wasn't a theoretical concept that I found or invented. It really was a representation of what students did. And essentially, we found that they were preoccupied to start with gaining access. And only the ones that were really motivated to do that, and it was hard in those days, stayed the course and kept going. And then the next thing they did was to find others with whom to work, those that they could identify with. The next thing they did was exchange information about themselves and around the course. And it was only when they'd gone through these 3 structured processes were they confident and able to share and build knowledge, which was obviously what the course and the learning was about. And then, interestingly, there was another stage beyond that, where a lot of them went back to quite personal development and also started to display really quite metacognitive aspects. And one of the key things was that everything that had happened online, they were able to look back on, and they were able to surface and understand their own process of learning, which stood them in very good stead for future learning. In other words, we realized that not only were they learning about the subject and applying it and learning from others about it, but they were also developing themselves as independent, competent learners. So when I realized that we had got hold of something very, very important. And it reflected the aspirations that all of us have, really, for ourselves and for our students. And so after that time, we kind of turned it back on its head and started to use it as a structure to train others. And I know some of you have used it. And the real reason it feels so intuitive and right is because it was based on this grounded model, a description of naturalistic behavior, but then making it easier for people to go through the stages and not expecting them to do something at an early stage that was inappropriate, but giving them the time and the opportunity and creating the environment where they're more likely to work together, to engage, to continue to be motivated. So I think it's quite helpful when you're using it and reading more about it to understand something about that original motivation. And then what you need to do if you're going for blended or online learning is to understand that at each stage of using the threshold concepts, you are really looking for similar learning outcomes, but the experiences are going to be different. And the term equivalence does become very, very important. And that means that you need to design learning events that provide experiences of equal value for on-campus, blended, online learners, regardless of the mode. They will not be the same, because if you try and emulate the campus experience, then it's deficient for online, and you won't have the best experience for everyone. But you can keep your outcomes in mind so that you're always heading towards the same outcomes. So this is one method that was developed called e-tivities, which really followed on from the 5-stage model. After my first book was published, loads of different people started using the 5-stage model, but everyone was saying they wanted a more practical way of making it work. So I thought, since some of you were already familiar with the model, that you might like to hear a little bit more about e-tivities. And e-tivities have gone on to be an absolutely critical part of the learning design methodology that's been built up around it, called Carpe Diem. That would be the subject of another talk if you're interested in it, but there is a lot on my website about it. So if you just look at my website, gillysalmon.com/carpe-diem, there's about 30 videos on there about how to do this, and more about all of this, the 5-stage model and e-tivities too. But this is just a summary. So rather than putting your focus into putting materials online, this is the structure that we use, and it works for any discipline. So instead of putting content up, you put a small piece of information or stimulus or challenge, which we call the spark. So it's a spark to start the action in the students. And interestingly, we make sure that the students undertake e-tivities at each stage of the 5 and in a sequence. And in that way, you enable them to become active learners, to work with each other, but also to go through the model at the same time. Hope that makes sense. And then the next thing is that you have an online activity, not discuss, but an online activity that involves each individual student posting a contribution in response to the spark. And it is quite important to get everyone to post something if you can, or to do something, and I'll show you some examples of that in a moment. Because otherwise, I'm sure you've all had this experience, 2 or 3 people will come in early on, talk to each other, and everyone else is excluded. So there always needs to be 2 stages, online, and then for the individual, and then an activity together, which is item 3 on the list. And then you make sure that there's clear instructions that they respond to each other. And we're quite specific about that, you know, write 100 words about this, find 3 other people with whom you agree or disagree, and so on. In my book, e-tivities, you'll find hundreds and hundreds of different ways of doing this for different disciplines. And a lot of the research on that was done with teachers in training. So you should find quite a lot that's relevant there. And then becomes the role of the e-moderator. The e-moderator is the name I give to the teacher online. Until now, it's all been design-based. And then it is important that you then summarize the activity, give the feedback, which is what the students crave, and if necessary, do a bit of teaching, critique, you know, point out holes in what they've argued, add additional value, so that the human part of it becomes this adding value, doing only what we can do using our knowledge, rather than constantly responding to every time somebody posts online. And most importantly, all the instructions to take part are in one key message. I hope that makes a bit of sense. Is everyone still with me? Can you give me a wave if you are? Okay. I'll go on to show you some examples. Here's one. Is a very simple example. This is from a course that I've taught for many, many, many years to train teachers to become e-moderators. But I think it shows you the anatomy of an e-tivity. So first of all, the e-tivity 2.3. This is a course that has 30 e-tivities and nothing else. So everything's based on e-tivities, and it's a 5-week course. So the student would know exactly where this sequence is. Timing and pacing is critically important in entirely digital courses. So it's e-tivity 2, week 2, e-tivity 3. And you always next put the purpose of the e-tivity. So many of us assume it'd be obvious to students while they're doing something, but if you put the purpose to the e-tivity, give it a nice title, they're much more likely to take part. And then the tasks. So this is an authentic task. This was a message that I got from somebody called Andy in a business course that I was teaching. He didn't like the group work, surprise, a lot of the time they don't. I'm really fed up with the people in this forum who spend their time looking in on those of us who are really doing all the work. If this keeps on, I'm off. you might have noticed that sometimes people can be quite rude online. They don't realise that they're easily identified and people will remember what they say. So his name was Andy. So I use this little message, an authentic piece of message, to put into the activity to enable my training moderators to consider it. So the first question was, what would you do? So if you got a message like this, what would you do? So they place the response. So you can see it's a single task, just one task. And then after they've posted their own, they're asked to respond, to look at the other people's messages to Andy, and then say how they'd feel if they received them. Now, this one little task, not more than 10 lines, is often one of the most important aspects of our e-moderating course, because people really begin to understand about communication online and how to deal with the more difficult messages. What that rude student, Andy, doesn't know, he's had about 5,000 responses to his message over the years. So, and then, of course, it's always important with the pacing that you get people to move on. So this is move on to lesson 4, summarising, which is a key skill. So I think you get the anatomy of what you're designing. So this structure is freely available online on my books, everywhere else, or if you do a Carpe Diem learning design workshop. And it is really important that when you begin to design, you use this kind of structure that's been tested and tested and tested, so it really does work. And then you're much more likely to be successful at using some of the simple and easy to use functions of your learning management system. Just to mention Carpe Diem, here's the URL of the website. Carpe Diem is a learning design methodology that incorporates the 5-stage model and e-tivities. You can see there's 6 stages to it. 1, really looking at the mission and the purpose of your module. Everything when you're designing really needs to have a strong design brief. And it's really good revisiting that at the very beginning of your design process. And then number 2, you do a storyboard. This is the one on the bottom left. And there you look at all the aspects. You've got the 5-stage model going along, and you look at all the aspects of what you're going to do online, what you're going to do through a video, what you might have people interacting with, where you're going to put feedback. So it is really important that you get that laid out at the beginning. And the origin of storyboards is obviously from people making movies, but we found it very effective for making effective learning and education too. Number 3, you then try out your e-tivities. So you design a few e-tivities, not in theory, but in practice, directly onto your learning management system. And then you get other people to review them. That's the beauty of it. Other people can try them. So it's a real prototype in the design process, and you can use it for that. And then you'll need to review everything you've done. Nearly everyone then changes their storyboard and sometimes even their mission, just from doing a little bit of prototyping on the activities. And always, always end with a committed action plan. What you're going to do next, who's going to do it, and when you're going to do it by. So, as I say, there's lots of video, there's a handbook and everything else to help you to do that, and lots more about e-tivities on that website there. I'm going to talk a little bit more about delivery now. Obviously, once you've done your design, you then build your course. But your work isn't over then. The good thing is that once you've built your course, it can be delivered many times, usually with only minor changes. and it can be scaled up. So, you know, I've run courses with as many as 7,000 participants, but each group of students will have an e-moderator looking after them. But what that e-moderator does is quite small, because most of the design and the whole process is already online. And the trouble is that we're often faced with expecting to do absolutely everything, and it often seems where we're adding technology and remoteness, so much more is added. But I'd just like to say a few things that we've learned, that you do not need to try and do everything that this poor guy is doing. If you do the design part that's well in advance of your students coming in, then it is entirely possible to have a quite different experience as an e-moderator and be able to add the real learning facilitation and the real knowledge value from threshold concepts that they need. So I think my argument is get the design part right, and then you come back into your own as a teacher in actually running the course. And I think that's where we should be, that your knowledge is used in that way. Just mention the Now robot that we've started using. Like much of modern robotics, it uses a digital twin. So you can actually, if you want to get some much more up-to-date and forward-looking technology into your courses, you can design online and then actually get the robot to move. So I'm saying, don't just think about what's available to you in your LMS, think about a whole range of other things as well. So I'm going to go through the 5-stage model again, and I hope now you'll think about it in two ways. One, from the point of view of how to design it, and secondly, from the point of view of how you, as an e-moderator or a facilitator, will do what you can to get students through each stage of the process. I'm going to talk about it in this way. For most of you and most of your students, arriving online is like really arriving in a new country, essentially. Just checking you can still hear me okay. I'm getting a bit of breaking up. Can you just give me a thumbs up if you can hear me okay? Yep, great. I'll keep going then. And people will arrive from different places in different vehicles, carrying different forms of baggage. So the great value of using the 5-stage model is you're not assuming everyone's at the same stage, nor do you have to get them to the same stage at that point. And then stage 2 is really, you're starting to climb the mountain. It looks fairly pretty. There's a little bit around to help you, and you look around for other people. And you probably set off together because it's a bit scary. But at this stage, you only really need to build a little team, probably 2 or 3 people. And the kind of e-tivities that you will have are those that help people to work in small groups. It's unrealistic to expect people to relate to 10, 20, 30 or 300 others at this stage. So think about it of climbing the mountain in the foothills. And at this point, the e-moderators really become the Sherpas, the people who know more about the landscape, know about the climate, to provide help to them and to help the team to succeed. So you're not really teaching them everything there is to know about mountain climbing, but you're starting to take them more steps with them as they go through. And step 3, you remember this is information sharing. What you need here are cooperative activities, Now, I'm certain all of you living in the north of Finland will know a lot about cooperative activities and mountain climbing, much more than I do, but I'm absolutely certain that it involves some additional equipment, and then it involves sharing knowledge about how to tackle a particular path. Well, that's what you're really thinking about at stage 3. You do not want people to suddenly have to do really difficult things, but again, you want them to spend another bit of the pathway looking upwards and working towards it together. So you still have your Sherpa or your assistant there, your guide there, and that's what the e-moderator or tutor will do. But you still want the effort to be from the students themselves, and by then you're starting to see an effective team. Now, step 4, the going is getting a little tough. There's always tends to be quite a big step between stage 3 and stage 4. And these are the real knowledge construction activities. For the students, they are following a path that they have never been on before. They're experiencing multiple concerns. They're expected to acquire threshold concepts, in other words, turning them into proper climbers as opposed to novices. At this stage, you're actually looking for them to go through portals of understanding. Now, if you've gone through the first 3 stages, when you get to stage 4, then you'll find it much easier to do true knowledge construction activities and for collaboration to happen. It's probably best for me to mention the difference between stage 3, which is cooperation, and stage 4, which is collaboration. A straightforward way of looking at it is that stage 3, everyone will still really be pursuing their own purposes. They're happy to work with others, but they have their own personal goals in mind. What you're aiming for is that by stage 4, that they're starting to have joint goals and that they're all bringing different things to the table, a true partnership or team situation. And I think when you're designing the activities, to understand the difference between those, they come out differently. So you've got 1, which is kind of access and motivation to continue. 2, which is team building, getting people learning together, doing simple things, getting them to know each other's strengths and what kind of support's needed. 3 is the information exchange and cooperative. And 4 is the collaborative activities and the knowledge construction. And of course, there's one more. When you get to the top of the mountain, you can look back about the way you've come. And I find it's very good when we're building the online course to actually have quite a lot of looking back activities, because they learn a lot about themselves, how they've performed and how they've done. But also, of course, they can look over the horizon and get a different view of the world, of what they've learnt. And that will help them with future courses. And they can also apply that to their everyday work and their everyday learning. And that means you're developing independent and metacognitive people rather than those that just, prepare for the exam. So I'd be very interested to know what you think about my metaphors of mountain climbing, of which I know nothing and you know much more, but applied to the 5 stages of the model. I just want to say just a little bit more about scaffolding actually and delivery of the learning. So we're getting rid of that guy that's trying to do everything to everybody. And instead, there's 2 key skills. When you're running courses with eAMK and through the 5-stage model, you need to do a lot of summarizing And to do that, you obviously wait, you hold back until the students have made their contribution. Because if you constantly respond, then you'll stop them from doing that, and they'll start looking to see whether they can get a response from you rather than focusing on each other and their own learning. But so you summarize, give feedback, and weave together their contributions. And the other aspect is that when you're designing, you need to build in ways of collecting data about how it's all going. I don't necessarily mean full data analytics, though it can be good if you can do that. But you do need to be getting constant feedback. You need to visibly be able to see whether what you've designed for is actually going to result in them going through this scaffold of learning and through the scaffold of knowledge and through the portals of threshold concepts. And the more you can set up the design to give you quick and easy ways of determining that, the better. And there does tend to be an emphasis on assessment of students' learning. And of course, you've got to do that somehow. But I hope you'll look back on my list of suggestions of how you can make that more authentic. I'll certainly leave all these slides with you for distribution. But I think also to look for ways that you can give really frequent small-scale feedback, or they can give feedback to each other, because that's really the marker of a sophisticated learner, to be able to take and give feedback to others. So build that into your design and it will help with the delivery. So don't forget the weaving and summarising. I've come to the end of my talk, but I just want to show you what else is on the end of these slides, because I'm aware that you might want to follow up with that. I'll mention again, look on my website. If you want to see Carpe Diem, that's on there as well. I'm sure you can transform your courses if each of you takes even one idea from what I've talked about in the last half an hour. It will make a difference. But I have also put all the references to the 5-stage model and e-tivities, about threshold concepts, and about authentic assessment. So I'm going to go back now and stop so that I can answer questions. I'm not aware, don't know whether I can see the chat box to see what questions have come in. Perhaps somebody can tell me about that.
It seems I'm asking the questions here, but sorry for that, and hopefully others will be. Can you hear me? Can you give?
Yes, I can just about hear you. You might need to shout at me a bit.
Yeah, I have a mic right in front of me. The question is about time and place dependence, especially when you have collaboration and cooperation. It seems to be that you need to be at the same time with the same people. But with online courses, people are going through the course at different stages. So would you comment on your model and this different timing of the students?
Right. Yeah. The model is based entirely on asynchronous remote students, not on synchronous. Personally, I don't use very much synchronous learning, and certainly for many years there's been none, because I teach and always have taught people all over the world from multiple time zones. And up until 2 years ago, I was in Australia anyway, so I was in a different location. So sometimes we would do a little bit of synchronous work to do summarising, and then perhaps do a follow the sun model where we'll repeat it maybe 2 or 3 times if people are around the world. But on the whole, the model is entirely designed, and so are the e-tivities, for asynchronous. So typically an e-tivity would run for within 4 to 10 days, depending on how complicated you wanted it to be. So I can assure you it works entirely well without the need for synchronous working.
Oh, hello, Gilly.
Can just about hear you.
I will try and shout. I have the microphone in front of me. I'd like to ask about assessing learning on your courses. What kind of methods do you use for assessing?
Assessment. I might be able to turn my, oh, that's the wrong thing. Sorry. Just going to turn it up a bit. Right, in terms of assessment, the way we do it is at the design stage, is place assessment and feedback into the whole of the storyboard and the timeline to start with. We know generally from good practice, it's good to have a lightweight assessment within 3 or 4 weeks of the course beginning. And we know as far as possible, obviously, to avoid exams at the end wherever we can. And then the authentic assessment will generally be focused on, transferring to practice, using real world case studies. So I'll give you one example of a course I've worked on very recently. And this was the MBA in horse riding at the University of Liverpool. Anyone who follows horse racing will know that there's Aintree in a very big horse race, the Grand National in March each year in Liverpool. And we get a fair few students who are coming from the horse racing industry. And they don't take too well and sit in lecture theatres. So we designed what we called a flipped race course. So the students did work in advance on health and safety in horse racing meetings, and then they did the assessment after they'd spent the week at the horse racing, all taking pictures. And the focus of one of the etivities was on what happens if a horse gets loose in a race meeting. That apparently, I didn't know before, but I've learned now, that apparently is the biggest health and safety risk, both to the horses, the jockeys, the crowd, and so on. And so they went around actually taking pictures in groups of risks and what was actually happening. And then they did their assessment, which was obviously using basic concepts of health and safety management. They did that by using all their live visual effects. So you need to think about, if you work around threshold concepts and what are really important concepts for your course, then it will come to you some of the more authentic ways in which you can use those to assess the students and really, marry the two up. But I know it's difficult. It is probably the hardest thing to transform, even harder than transforming the mode of education. But I think if you work on it as a design task and integrated, then you will find it a lot easier. I hope I've answered your question there.
Hello, Professor Salmon. Since 2006, when we met in Leicester, in Carpe Diem, I have implemented e-tivities. And I first started with my junior colleagues in intensive care, and we amalgamated simulation and intensive care and e-tivities related so that students could prepare for the simulation sessions. And we had about 20. Then we decreased the number, but always we had the difficulty to motivate the students to really do. There were 30% of those who were very keen to do and get beneficial learning experiences, but then there was this 30% who did not complete that. And since that, I have had the problem how to manage with those dropouts and how to motivate, how to pace. And now I have found that in intensive care, I could link those sparks into Vanderbilt University's wonderful ECG recordings and advices, and it's very hooking for a teacher to search material. But now in Masters of Global Health, I have the problem of pacing, because in epidemiology, etivities are a good way to create basic concepts and learn through research and so. But the final outcomes, when you put eAMK and a larger assignment, may be difficult. So motivation, pacing, and amalgamating small eAMKs, and the final fifth step, developing something, they are the continuous challenge for me.
I'm not sure that I can do a quick fix on that, but I do know that we're learning more and more and more about how to design and to embed motivation all the way through, and pacing, and to incorporate assessment. I mean, my best suggestion is that you do have a good look at your overall course from the point of view of design, rather than trying to tinker with, we need more motivation and we need more this. It is to do with a holistic approach. Having said that, you're not really doing too badly, you know. I'm sure that you want a better outcome, but you're actually doing very, very well if you're getting most of them through. So, I mean, if you, I'm running out of time now because we're running late and I've got to go and speak at another conference. But if you want to email me, I'll send you some more suggestions after today. I have recently designed a global health course, so I'd like to have a go at that. Very best of luck with all of it. And if anyone wants to follow up with me, they're very welcome.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.